Hey everyone, welcome back. It's been a long time and I should have made a video long time ago, but I just started university and the first term took a while to get set up and I'm back in Delhi for a while, so I thought restart making a video, making videos for this channel. A lot more about what happened in the last 4 5 months in a different video. I'll make a video about how I got my co-op in University of Waterloo and all that later. Um, Maybe I'll make one, but yeah. In this video, I want to talk about Lucia Auth. It's something which is picking up, and I'm really excited to see where this will go because in the Next.js space, NextAuth or Auth.js, as it has been renamed now, has been dominating for a really long time, and no other authentication provider except maybe Clerk, and not even Clerk, honestly, or maybe Supabase has come even close to, getting to where NextAuth is in the Next.js space. And I feel like Lucia Auth might get close to where NextAuth is right now. So let me just share my screen. So, um, yep, this is the Lucia Auth documentation. You can go to lucia-auth.com, link in the description. But basically, it's an auth library. It does a lot of work just like how NextAuth does it. But the difference is it provides you much more control over, cookie handling, session handling, and all that stuff. It in I'll actually link a video down below by Josh. If you haven't checked out his channel, you should really check it out. I think Josh Tried Coding is the channel. He has amazing videos on Next.js, front-end web development, even some back-end stuff. And he talks about why Lucia Auth is might be a game changer in authentication in Next.js. He talks about how it provides the right amount of abstraction required in an authentication library, just like what ShadCN's UI library does for the UI space. That's why I'm really excited to see where this goes, and I feel like this video will kind of give you an idea on how Lucia Auth works in an application. But basically, yeah, if you go around and read this before looking at this video if you want, but I'll cover basically how it works. To start off, what I did was go into getting started. I went into the Next.js app router. Actually, I went into these tutorials and then I downloaded these examples from the Next.js app router. So that is what is over here. Right. So, um, I have two terminal windows here. Yeah, windows here, Tmux windows, but one is for, let me actually rename this. This is for password auth, and the other one is for GitHub. If you just see the bottom corner of the page. So I'll start with GitHub actually because it's easier to explain how it's working. But if I started up, basically I just downloaded the example, installed the dependencies, went to GitHub, created an application and generated this GitHub client ID and client secret. Actually, let me just tell you how I did that too. Just went to github.com, went into settings, um, go to developer settings, go to OAuth apps. I created an app called Test Lucia, and then it just created a client ID. I had to generate a client secret and then copy it over to this. I'll remove this later, so don't try using this. You won't be able to. But yeah, that's about it for the setup. And then I just run pnpm. I just ran pnpm dev like that, and that ran this development server at localhost 3000. So now if I go to, nope, wrong place. If I go to localhost 3000, I have this application set up with sign in and sign in with GitHub. So I'll actually run this once and then show how this works. If I just click on sign in with GitHub, I have no user right now in the database. I'll actually run this on a different profile, sorry. Let's run this here, localhost 3000, and then sign in with GitHub. And it I basically authorize the application once to work with my username, but you'll go to the GitHub screen. It asks you to authorize the application and then redirects back to this. But once it is done, you will see this hi Kavanwali, which is my GitHub username, and then user ID is this. So the and then obviously you can sign out. I'll talk a lot more in depth about how this works under the hood because that's what this video is about. Okay, let's start from the scratch. Let's go to what the first page is. The page router, it's basically if there's no user invalidate request which is coming from auth this so if I'll just look at validate request, I'll talk about what this is in later, but basically it's just seeing if a user exists in the session. If the user does not exist, it's going to login. That's where I want to start off for the day. If I go to login slash page.tsx, again, it does the same thing. If user exists, then it redirects to the front page, else it shows this page which we have over here. Actually, just to I'll clear the database. This is using an SQLite database. Um, so I just cleared the database, but basically, if I look at this page now, if I click on this link, it basically redirects to slash login slash GitHub. So let's look at what that might be. Slash login slash GitHub, and then look at route.ts. So it has a basic get function, which is the what we're doing if we're going to this, right? So first of all, it's generating something called a state from Arctic. If you look at the Lucia Auth documentation, yep, if you look, not this, I just wanted to show you guys this later, but I'm not sure where this was exactly, but if you look at, say, GitHub auth, let's go over here, Arctic. Yep. So they recommend using Arctic. It's basically a lightweight library for providing APIs. API authorization URLs. Basically, what it does is that it generates a state for you. I'll talk about what that is just by console or logging over here. What state is and URL is. Let's console.log that out. And then once we're back, let's click on sign in with GitHub and look at what this does. It it generates a state which is a random string, and then it generates a URL using this GitHub dot this. This is basically GitHub is just new GitHub, and this new GitHub is from. Okay, let's go up. This is also from Arctic, but basically this generates an authorization URL, which is basically this URL over here. If you haven't done this kind of authentication before, but if you look at GitHub Auth, um, maybe that might provide some kind of an idea. Yep, so if you look at this over here in the documentation, they provide this, right? HTML, login, OAuth, authorize, and then scope something, and then client ID. If you look at what this is, the state. So authorization protocols provide state parameter that allows you to restore the previous state. Why they do that is to like have a constant, like a unique state value every time, and then when you go back to that application, it can authorize with that state. So that's where Arctic comes into use and provides a good interface to do that. It basically puts that into the state and then generates this URL for you with a response time of flow, and then it picks up the client ID from your .env and then sends it into the get request. So if I look at what this was doing again, yeah. So it set the cookies GitHub OAuth state to state and then does this. So if you look at your application again, if you look at your application cookies, if you look at GitHub auth state, it now has this over here. So let me just pull down my laptop over here. It has this value over here, which was the state which was generated over here, and then whatever things this has over here. But basically now what happens is in my GitHub authentication, like my uh, if I had created my GitHub app, right? If I when I created this, I set my authorization callback URL to this. So it goes back to login slash GitHub slash callback and then route.ts, and then it runs a GET request on this. Now let's see what this is, right? So when it goes back to this, basically GitHub provides three things. Actually, two things. One is the code and one is the state. This is where the state comes into use. It basically you can match the two states, and if both the states are the same, then your authentication is fine because it's coming from GitHub properly. That's why we were storing the state inside cookies, which we're now getting, and then we're checking that the state, if state is not equal to stored state, then we just return a 400, which is a bad request. So basically, we're getting the code. I'll talk about what the code is in a second, but actually, let's do that right now. Um, yeah, it's console.log out code. Okay, let's go back. Actually, yeah, we can just sign out and then sign in again. So look at the code right now. It basically gives you back this code. Basically, it calls this login GitHub callback and then question mark code is equal to this, which is a URL parameter. Gives you that code, and then you need to take that code and then using this GitHub from the auth.ts. If I look at what GitHub is, which was GitHub we saw earlier, let me just go back to callback. We need to validate that authorization code that it is completely correct for our application, and then it returns back the tokens which are needed. Now the token returns back an access token. Okay, I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail because access tokens, if you have any OAuth application with say GitHub or Google or Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever you're using, whenever you authorize into that application, they give you back something called an access token that might be specific to the user, that might be specific to your application. When it's specific to your application, most of the times it's an API key. But when it's specific to a user, they give you back an access token. Now, whenever you make a request back to GitHub, or GitHub API or Google API, you need to pass that access token back into the fetch request to say that, yes, this is for this user and give me back data if I'm authorized to get back that data, right? That's why we're getting these tokens back from this. And basically, Arctic does a really good job of abstracting this out so that we don't need to have memorize the URLs and do all that, but basically we still need to do that, and we have control over what all we are doing over here. So we're getting back tokens, and this basically gives back tokens dot access token, right? Yeah, so we send that back into api.github.com/user. Basically, that's an API endpoint which GitHub gives us to return back the user when provided the access token. So when you fetch this, they will provide you the user back. So if I just do this, let's do console.log user. So this will return back the, oh, sorry, GitHub user. GitHub's user. So if I click on sign out and then sign in with GitHub again. Okay, so they return back the GitHub user, and this is all the data which comes back from GitHub when you fetch this API endpoint. So what all things do we need here? This generates the GitHub ID and then takes GitHub user.id, which is the unique ID which GitHub assigns to my user, right? So this is all the data I have. So basically, this is where it gets interesting. Now, what they're doing is db.prepare. I won't go too much into detail about this query because this is using SQLite. But basically, if you know anything about SQL, it does select star from user. It fetches all the rows from user, where from the user table where the GitHub ID underscore ID is the ID which is set over here. Why we're doing that is, if I look at my db.ts, I have two tables over here. One table is a user table, which has the GitHub ID, the ID, and the username. So we're fetching that to see if a user already exists in our database with that user. If I actually look at, say, SQLite viewer, and then I can actually drag and drop my main.db file into this. If you look at this over here and look at user, this is the user I have inside my database already. Um, so yeah, so because in this case the existing user returned yes, obviously there was one existing user, it goes to this block. I'll talk about this block later, but because this is not happening, because this return statement is not happening, it goes to this now. Here, it generates a user ID. Generate ID, if I look at what generate ID is, it's coming from Lucia. It basically generates an ID specific to that user, and you can use that ID to insert into the database, right? And then, so basically, in this step, we've created a row in our database with that user. This is where the authentication parts gets more interesting. Now it creates a session. A session is basically one login for a user. You can have multiple sessions. For example, say I have logged in into the website from my laptop, and I've logged in into the website from my phone. So I have one user but two sessions for the user. So it creates a session using Lucia Auth, using my user ID which was generated over here, and then it creates a cookie for the session for this particular session. So if I'll just look at my application, go to the application tab over here. Unfortunately, I don't think I can zoom in. Oh, I do. I can. Never mind. It basically creates it auth underscore session. Actually, let me console.log session cookie, and then I'm going to actually remove the database so that I don't have the user already in my database. So if I sign out, then sign in with GitHub. So if I look at this over here, I have the session. It basically returns back this ID, which was generated by this line. And then it returns a user ID. Obviously, fresh is true. I'll talk about what that is in a second. But it basically creates this session and then creates a cookie with that session for me with the name auth underscore session. And then over here, we're basically setting cookies dot set to the name. This is the key of the cookie with this on the auth underscore session, which was the name, and then the value to the value of the cookie over here, which was e5 whatever, and then HTTP only is true. For example, you can see that over here, secure is fall, this is lax, same site is lax, etc. And then once that cookie is set, we're returning a new response for 3 or 2. If the user already existed, then what we're doing is we're taking the ID of the user already existing and then doing the same things again. Honestly, this code could be a little better. But this works. It just felt like this particular code over here was being repeated twice, which is unnecessary. But anyways, it's taking the ID of the user and then setting the session ID the same way. But the only difference is we're not generating an ID again. How this helps? The auth session is being set in the cookie. Now, the next time I go into the application, when I refresh over here, right? It knows that I'm already authenticated. How? Because it goes into the cookie, it checks that my session is already existing and it's correct. How is that? If I go into page.tsx, it checks this validate request. So if I look at the code for validate request, which is inside libauth, okay, let's talk about this, why it's caching this, because I found this interesting enough over here. How was it? Where was that? Um, okay, let's just look at this over here. Validate request. Yep. So it's basically caching this to prevent unnecessary database calls. It's just a Next.js feature. Actually, it's a React feature, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, React 18 feature. You can cache this function. It basically, the function is a promise. It takes in a user and a session. And then, so if I check over here, Oh wait, it returns a user and a session. My bad, my bad. It doesn't take anything. It basically checks from the cookie if I have anything with the session cookie name. Session cookie name is auth underscore session in this case. I think this is just set auth underscore session by default unless you change it. So this is there, and then the value it takes that value, which is e5 whatever in this case. Actually, let's do that over here. Console.log session ID. Probably should have done this. Yep, see over here, if I cannot do that, yep, so it gives you that session ID from the cookie, and then it tries to validate the session over here. It basically validates session, it just checks that the session exists and it's doing the right thing. If you want to learn more about this, you can go to this URL over here. Basically, it's just checking that the session exists and it returns back the user if the session exists. Like over here, what was that? Yep, this. So it has the session and the user. In this case, actually, let's do this as well, just to show you guys what's happening. So it basically gives you the user and the session. The user is the database user which we had, and then the session is ID, user ID, whatever. Now, if the result has a session and the session is fresh, a fresh session basically means that it's basically expired, and then you need to create. Uh, okay, let me put this way. If I just look at this, yep. So delete the session cookie if it's invalid and create a new session cookie when the expiration gets extended, which is indicated by session.fresh. This means that the cookie is basically um, extended right now and it's fresh in that sense. So we need to create a new session cookie and then replace the existing cookie which is already there. That's the easiest way I can put it in. Hopefully that didn't confuse you. But basically that happens. And then if the result dot session does not exist anyways, then we just create a new blank session and then set cookies to this. This just means that log out. Um, it's just doing this weird try catch because apparently Next.js throws when you attempt to set cookie when rendering the page. Apparently this is a known issue, but Vercel has yet to acknowledge the issue. But yeah, that's something. 23 minutes in. Okay. So that's about it from the validate request. So basically, it's just doing all that and then returning back the result. So over here, I can get back the user, which is this. So I'll have the user ID, and also so that should do that. Yep. Okay. That's the GitHub authentication. Last thing. Okay. Sign out. If I click on sign out, what that is doing is if I look at the logout function, it's doing this. It's invalidating the session. It basically tells Lucia to invalidate the session cookie, which is already there. And also that if another request has been made with that particular session ID, mark it as well, it doesn't work, right? And then so the session cookie, we replace the session cookie with a new session cookie which is blank. So since it is blank, it just replaces that particular key over here. I think it's this one because it's completely empty. Yep. And then it just redirects back to the login page. So that's it from the GitHub auth part. I'll go over the password auth as well because that's something which distincts this from NextAuth, because NextAuth basically discourages email and password authentication, for good reason, because if not handled properly, it can be very insecure. And then the reason Lucia Auth, actually, if you look at this GitHub discussion from them, Lucia Auth honest discussion. Yep. So this is he's one of the maintainers on this. So basically, he talks about why he he hasn't completely removed password authentication in this, so you can read about this over here. But basically, if you want to have password authentication, you can still have it over here, unlike in auth.js or next.auth, where you can, but it's really hard to implement it because they discourage it very strongly. But basically, uh, same thing. What this is doing is it takes the user validate request, logout is the same. I wouldn't go over that again, just to save time. It goes to login, so app slash login slash page.tsx. So in the login function, it basically just go to localhost 3001. Goes to the slash login, which has a form with username and password. This over here. So this is a server function. It basically calls the server action over here, the form action. It gets the form data. It's a server function, gets the username, does some validation on the username, gets the password, does some password validation on the password, and then if the user already exists, well, it he should exist for the, or he or she or they should exist for the user to be able to log in. And then it basically runs this query to check if the username already exists. If they do not exist, then incorrect username or password. Then we check if the password is correct. For this, I'll go over how registration works first. And if password is also correct, they basically do the same thing with the session which we were doing in GitHub, and then sets the cookie. Let's talk about registration because that will explain how this password hashing thing works. So basically in this, same thing, if I don't have an account, I actually have an account in this, I'll have to, actually, I don't need to do that. Just do coven, then password. So basically it takes all this, takes the username, does some validation. Honestly, this is not needed again. But because it's just logging in. Actually, it's needed in registration, but I felt that it wasn't needed in login. But yeah, it's there for some reason. And then here, this is what makes it interesting. It basically takes argent2 ID, which is a hashing function. So if you don't know what hashing functions are, it basically takes it's a method of encrypting something. So when you put in your password over here, it generates a random key or a particular key, and then using that key only can you decrypt back the password. So it uses that key to encrypt your password, and then in during login it basically uses that key to decrypt back your password, and then see if the password is correct, right? So basically how hashing works is that it's so like for example argent2 id or something like bcrypt or scrypt, I think they are so strong that it to your generate a particular key, which the only because that's the key is the only way it can decrypt itself. You can actually use other ways to brute force into it, but finding that particular key is very, very hard. So yeah, that's why passwords are hashed basically. That's how passwords are hashed. Okay, then so basically it's just using argent2 ID, which is the hashing function, which is recommended by Lucia Auth. You can actually go over that over here if you to username and password. Next is app router. Um, Yep. So it talks about how they recommend Argento ID. Oslo, which is what Lucia is built on, they also provide script and bcrypt, so you can use those as well. So it basically does that. It generates the ID just like before, inserts that into the table. It inserts the hashed password. This is where hash password. This is where it becomes very important because you need to hash the password before putting it into the database. Because if you have the password in plain string, it is vulnerable to attacks in the sense that people can find out the passwords of the users if your database gets leaked. Um, so yeah, So always store hashed passwords. Then it's just inserting that, creating a session, creating the cookie, creating all that just like before, and then running a catch function over here. Constrain unique username is already being used. So that's about it from registration. Now let's talk about how the decrypting was working in login. It basically verifies the two passwords with the key which was generated by Ubuntu ID. So that's what this is doing. It's a promise which is being returned back by a Boolean. If the valid password, if it's not valid, then we just return incorrect username or password. So basically, if I do password over here, over here, log that out. If I continue, basically generates the user ID, username, and hashed password. This password is, see how this is like really random. This can be generated only by the Ubuntu ID, which is being used by it already. Um, and then it just does the same verification as we saw before. I look at actually, Lucia Auth. Validate request is the same. Validate session. It's the same thing as before, no changes to this. The only change is in how the registration and login is working. And yeah, so it generates that and during login. So if I just, yeah, let's do that during login. So if I sign out and then do a login, I'll put in an incorrect password. So it just said the existing user has this password. So it checks basically compares these two passwords, existing user dot password and the password to check if the verification is correct. And then it basically says yes, it is correct, or no, it is not correct. Then logs in or doesn't log in. So that is it for this video, which I didn't expect to be this long, but I went blabbering about a lot of things, and hopefully I didn't confuse you. Because authentication, when it comes to NextAuth, it abstracts away so much of this control. I wouldn't say abstracts away, but it takes away so much of this control that you don't realize how authentication actually works. But because Lucia Auth gives you these functions, you need to write them themselves. You get that control, and then you can manipulate that however you want inside your application. And it provides you a kind of like a Shatsian experience in terms of authentication. And yep, that's probably it for this video. I'll link down a few the examples in the description and the documentation and the video by Josh. Do check that out. I highly recommend by checking out that video. Was really it explained a lot of things to me about why Lucia Auth should be used over or could be used over NextAuth. Should it's an opinionated it's a topic of opinion. A lot of opinions are there, and you need to make your own opinions based on what suits your needs the most. So again, that's it for this video. I'll be coming up with more videos soon. Stay tuned. Goodbye.